Hi, I'm John Stevenson. We'll be looking at Sodom and Gomorrah in our continuing study of the book of Genesis. Genesis chapter 18, we saw where two angels and the Lord met with Abraham as he was sitting at the door of his tent. Here in chapter 19, at the beginning of the chapter, we're going to see two angels meeting Lot as he sits at the gate of the city of Sodom. Back in chapter 18, we saw the narrative beginning in the heat of the afternoon. Now it takes place up with the events of that same evening. In Genesis 18, we saw Abraham, how he ran to meet them, bowed down before them. Here in Genesis 19, as these angels come to Sodom, Lot rises to meet them, bows down before them. In chapter 18, we saw Abraham inviting these visitors to eat and rest from their travels. Here in chapter 19, we're going to see Lot inviting them to eat, spend the night in his house. In chapter 18, they immediately accepted Abraham's invitation. It's going to be interesting. Here in chapter 19, Lot invites them, but they're initially going to refuse Lot's invitation. But as he insists, they'll eventually and perhaps reluctantly accept. In chapter 18, we saw Abraham interceding for Lot. Here in chapter 19, it's going to be Lot interceding on behalf of these angelic visitors. In chapter 18, we saw Abraham told of the impending judgment of Sodom and Gomorrah. And now as these angels come to visit Lot, they are going to tell Lot of the impending destruction on these same cities, Sodom and Gomorrah. In chapter 18, Abraham's wife, Sarah, expresses disbelief at the promise of God concerning the birth of a son. Here it's going to be Lot in chapter 19. His wife will express disbelief at God's warning not to look back at the doomed city of Sodom. She's going to look back and she's going to be destroyed as a result. In chapter 18, it culminated in the birth of a son, in the promise of the birth of Isaac. Here in chapter 19, it's going to culminate in the death of the city. In Genesis chapter 18, Abraham believed the promises of God. Here in chapter 19, Lot is going to be fearful due to his unbelief once he leaves the city. In chapter 18, God gave Abraham a son through his wife Sarah. Lot's going to have two sons as well, but his sons are going to be born through incest with his own daughters. It won't be a pretty picture. In chapter 18, Abraham's offspring were blessed. Here in chapter 19, we're going to see his offspring that are ultimately cursed. In chapter 18, it pictures somebody who's in a covenant relationship with God. That's Abraham, who's in that covenant relationship. In Genesis 19, we're going to see in Lot's story, it pictures one who is approaching life independently of God, not trusting in him, not walking with him. 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 8 reminds us, it tells us that Lot, while he was living among these people in Sodom, while he was living among them, felt his righteous soul tormented day after day with their lawless deeds. Now, we don't get a sense that that's necessarily the case as we read the story of Genesis. Peter's actually given us more commentary on it, maybe reading between the lines. And the truth is, this is what happens when a Christian lives among pagans. Very oftentimes, it's a little bit like taking a white glove and putting it in mud. The mud doesn't usually become glovey. Instead, the glove becomes muddy. And so Lot was affected, and sometimes we, when we're living in the midst of a pagan culture and society, we can be affected too. So there's a warning here for us. Genesis chapter 19, verse 1. Now the two angels came to Sodom in the evening as Lot was sitting in the gate of Sodom. I put here a picture of just an example, and this happens to be a gate over in Caesarea by the ocean. But notice we're sitting in the gate. You can see the opening, and it looks like we're in a big room. But this was part of the entire gate assembly. And there'd be seats along the edges. And here's Lot. He's sitting in this meeting place, the place where the elders of the city might do business, where there might be buying and selling and meeting and contracts and just all sorts of things going on. And Lot is there, and he sees them. He sees these visitors. He rose to meet them and bowed down with his face to the ground. He's showing them respect to these strangers. And he said, "Now behold, my lords," again, this is a greeting of respect, "please turn aside into your servant's house and spend the night and wash your feet. Then you may rise early and go on your way." And they said, however, "No, but we shall spend the night here in the square," probably in the gate. They don't want to impose, but I almost get the sense they don't really want to be in Lot's household. Yet he urged them strongly. You see, Lot already sees there's going to be a problem here. He knows enough about the city to know the character of the city, and so he urges them strongly. So they turned aside to him, entered his house, and he prepared a feast for them and baked unleavened bread, and they ate. And everything looks good. But then before they lay down, the men of the city, the men of Sodom, surrounded the house, both young and old, all the people from every quarter. Notice how this isn't just a couple of miscast people that are doing the wrong thing. It's people from all over the city, representing all sorts of areas of the city. Verse 5, and they called to Lot and said to him, where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us that we may have relations with them, or as the Hebrew would say, that we may know them. And this is not just that we want to check out their ID card. They're seeking to bring these men out and sexually abuse them, to rape them, because they're seeking to make their own power over them, so that they can do what they will with these men. But Lot went out to them at the doorway and shut the door behind them. It's interesting to note, just the sort of the evolution of the door and how that plays out in archaeology at different times in the culture of the land of Canaan. At this time in history, it was a sort of an uncivilized time. They had these strong wooden doors, and so that's the case in Lot. He shuts the door behind him, and he says, please, my brothers, do not act wickedly. Now behold, I have 2 daughters who have not had relations with man. Please let me bring them out to you, and do to them whatever you like, only do nothing to these men, inasmuch as they have come under the shelter of my roof. Now, no matter how I slice this, I feel uncomfortable with this, because I come from a very different culture that says, protect your daughters. I'd be, saying, this is the last thing that would come into my mind. But that's not the culture from which Lot comes. He comes from a culture in which hospitality is everything. Taking care of your daughters, that's way down on the list. I come from a different culture where taking care of my daughters is number 1, and hospitality, well, that's way down on the list. Now, I'm not saying that we should take less care of our daughters, but perhaps our ideal for hospitality is far too shallow. And so I'm not saying that I would do the same thing that Lot would do. Far from it. But his desire to protect that integrity of the hospitality is something that doesn't ring as strongly in our culture, and perhaps that is a commentary on our culture today. In any case, he's offering his daughters as a substitute, and that's a substitute that's going to be rejected. In verse 9, but they said, stand aside. You see, to them it's not about sex. It is more about empowerment. We want to exercise our power, our cruelty, our control of these visitors. Stand aside, they said. Furthermore, they said, this one came in as an alien. Now they're not only angry and want to get at the 2 strangers, now they want to get at Lot as well. Furthermore, they said, this one came in as an alien, and already he's acting like a judge. Now we will treat you worse than them. And so Lot now is on the chopping block as well. So they pressed hard against Lot and came near to break the door. But the men, that is these visitors, reached out their hands and brought Lot into the house with them and shut the door, and they struck the men who were at the doorway of the house with blindness, both small and great, because remember it had been both small and great that had come there from all over the city, so that they wearied themselves trying to find the doorway. Their spiritual blindness is now matched by a physical blindness as well. Then the 2 men said to Lot, who else have you here? A son-in-law, and your sons and your daughters, and whomever you have in the city, bring them out of the place, for we are about to destroy this place, because their outcry has become so great before the Lord that the Lord has sent us to destroy it. So Lot gets the news. Sodom is going to be destroyed. And notice those that can be delivered are Lot and his family, whether they be sons or son-in-law, whoever there is in the city that is going to connect themselves with Lot, they can be delivered. Lot went out, and no, he doesn't have any sons, so Lot went out and spoke to his sons-in-law, who were to marry his daughters. Presumably they were engaged. The betrothal has not yet been completed, but they're still called sons-in-law. And he says to them, "Get up out of this place, for the Lord will destroy the city." But he appeared to his sons-in-law to be jesting. They can't take this news seriously. They hear it through ears of unbelief. When morning dawned, so some time has passed, the angels urged Lot, saying, "Get up, take your wives." Now, wait a minute. They had just been told the city's going to be destroyed, and yet they're here still in the city by the next morning. There's been a delay, and that's not explained. But they say to him, "Get up, take your wife and your two daughters who are here, or you will be swept away in the punishment of the city." And again we read, but he hesitated. Lot is having a hard time letting go of this pagan city. He's been in there such a long time. He's begun to identify with the city, and he has a hard time letting go. Do you ever have a hard time letting go of something? Letting go of the world, letting go of maybe not what you've considered a bad thing, but it's not God's thing, and you still want to hold on to it. So the men seized his hand, and the hand of his wife, and the hands of his two daughters. Boy, that must have been an armful. For the compassion of the Lord was upon him. God in compassion had sent them, and now God in compassion brings them out of the city, and they brought him out and put him outside the city. Then the Lord rained on Sodom and Gomorrah. I'm moving forward a few verses and passing over that part where his wife looks back and she dies. But then the Lord rains on Sodom and Gomorrah brimstone and fire from the Lord out of heaven. And he overthrew those cities and all the valley and all the inhabitants of the cities and what grew on the ground. So much so that even though archaeologists have looked, we have not yet found the city that we can say, there it is, that is the original Sodom, that is the original Gomorrah. There are a few places where archaeologists have found, they've said, well, maybe that's the one. But thus far, nothing has been yet confirmed. Now, the story goes on from there. Lot's going to ask, well, Lord, can I go to this little city over here? In fact, the name of that city is called the little place. Zoar is the way you say that in Hebrew. And God gives him permission, but ultimately we see Lot in a cave with his daughters. His wife dies looking back at the city of Sodom, with his two daughters who cause him to become drunk. Sort of reminds me a little bit of the story of Noah, where Noah became drunk in his tent. In this case, his daughters, they get him drunk, and they lie with him, and they each become impregnated by him, and they bring forth two sons who become two nations, Moab and Ammon. And these two nations who are going to live to the east of the Dead Sea are going to be future enemies of Israel. So Moab, notice Moab, its northern border is that Arnon River, and then Ammon to the northeast of Moab. In fact, if you go to Jordan today, and I've been in Jordan, and the capital city of Jordan is to this day called Amman, which that's where you get that name from. It's right about where our word Ammon is there, and that's where the Ammonites lived. And so these two people are eventually going to be the enemies of God's people. Meanwhile, the camera shifts, before we leave this chapter, the camera shifts to Abraham, who had bargained with God as an attempt to save the life of Lot. And of course, remember, if there's 50 righteous, how about if there's 45 or 40 or 30 or 20 or 10? And now the next day Abraham gets up. He rose early in the morning and went to the place where he'd stood before the Lord. And he looked down toward Sodom and Gomorrah and toward all the land of the valley. And he saw, and behold, the smoke of the land ascended like the smoke of a furnace. And Abraham doesn't necessarily know at this point that God has actually already delivered Lot. He's probably thinking, I asked God for 10. Why didn't I go down to 1? And the good news of the gospel is that there was one righteous. We talked about that in our last chapter. That there was one righteous for us who took our sins upon himself so that we could be delivered from that destruction that is promised for the entire world. Have you come to trust in that one? That one who takes you out of the city to a new city, to a heavenly city where you have life.